We're joined today by Eric Settle, Forward Party candidate for Pennsylvania Attorney General. Why are you seeking this office?
Thank you, Francine, for having me today. I have been in and around government my entire career, and I have always looked at the Office of Attorney General as an important office in the Commonwealth. And an opportunity came along for the Forward Party, a new party established by Andrew Yang and Christine Todd Whitman, to try to create a centrist party. And they approached me late last year and said, would you be willing to come forward? In order for the Forward Party to be established as a party in Pennsylvania, they needed a statewide candidate. And so they asked me if I would run for Attorney General. And having had the experience in and around government, I thought at this point in my career, I was ready for the opportunity to go back into public service.
For those that may be unfamiliar, what are the main platforms of the Forward Party? The
main platform of the Forward Party is about election reform. The idea is to solve problems from the center. We have a very polarized electoral system now, and the Forward Party is trying to find a way to say, how can we solve problems from the center? And I would say the most important part of the Forward Party platform is election reform. So open primaries, ranked choice voting, independent redistricting, congressional districts and legislative districts, so that the voters their voices can be heard and we can reduce the amount of partisanship we have in politics.
Now, you've worked under elected officials under both political affiliations. What attracted you to the Forward Party as opposed to running as a major party candidate?
So it's interesting. when I had worked for Tom Ridge as Deputy General Counsel, when I came out of government, I was in my mid-30s, and I thought that I wanted to get back into public service. I actually began the process of running for Congress in what was then the 13th Congressional District of Pennsylvania. It was the seat that Marjorie Margolis-Mezvinsky held, and it was a very, very closely divided district. And so I actually spoke with some local officials, and there was an interest in me as a moderate Republican running in that district. And so I began the process, and fairly soon into the process, I was at my then 7-year-old's soccer game. And I realized that if I were running for Congress, I would be at everybody else's soccer game but my own son. And so I made a decision that said, you know what, for the next 20 years, I'm going to focus on my career, pay for college, save for retirement, and if the opportunity came, I would then step forward into public service. And when that opportunity happened a few years ago, the Republican Party that had been part of my life for my whole political career had changed. It really had become the party of Donald Trump. And it made me both uncomfortable and unelectable. And so when the Forward Party came and said, here's an opportunity, I thought this is a way I can give back to the community by trying to be an independent Attorney General. In a year when, 2024, having an independent Attorney General is incredibly important. Because if you think about it, January 17th, the new Attorney General of Pennsylvania will be sworn in. And it is very possible that on January 17th, the 2024 presidential candidate election is still in dispute. And so wouldn't it be better to have an independent Attorney General who can make the decision and defend the Commonwealth to make sure it's a fair outcome, whatever that outcome might be?
Now, you briefly referenced your service under former Governor Ridge. Talk a little bit about the experience that you could bring to the Attorney General's office.
Sure. So when I was in the governor's office, I served as Deputy General Counsel, and I was given two major areas: healthcare and environmental, two very important areas for the Commonwealth. And those are also areas where the Attorney General plays a role. So, for example, in healthcare, the Attorney General oversees charitable assets. So all the issues we have with nonprofit hospitals being acquired by for-profit entities is something that is directly within the Attorney General's jurisdiction. So that's something that, with my background in healthcare, I feel I can bring to the job the ability to oversee those transactions in a way that protect Pennsylvanians better than perhaps they're being protected now with attorney generals who, frankly, don't have the same level of experience I have in the healthcare world.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and in the environmental area, obviously the Attorney General has joint jurisdiction with the Department of Environmental Protection to make sure we have clean air and clean water in Pennsylvania. And it's interesting, having worked in the environmental area in the 90s and the focus on clean coal and clean mining, it's interesting with climate change how the issues have gotten so much bigger. I mean, now it really is, we see the effects of climate change in our Commonwealth. And I think the Attorney General really has to now look to make sure that we're doing all the things we can to protect our climate.
You talked about how much of your former work touches upon aspects of insurance coverage and healthcare law. What attracted you to practicing in this area of the law?
Well, it's interesting. I had served on a board of a hospital, the Bryn Mawr Rehab Hospital outside of Philadelphia. And so I had an interest in healthcare when I was in private practice at two large Philadelphia law firms. But when I had the opportunity to come to Harrisburg and was actually given one of my favorite assignments, is I was the governor's liaison to the academic medical centers of Pennsylvania. So Penn and Pitt and Allegheny, all those institutions worked closely with me. So that gave me that opportunity to say, healthcare means a lot to people. It was an interesting area. And so when I came out of Harrisburg, I began a career in healthcare. I began my career at Aetna US Healthcare as an in-house counsel, and ultimately became the regional general counsel for Pennsylvania.
What do you see as the biggest challenges or problems in our current healthcare system, and how would you address them as Attorney General?
So I think there's two issues. I think there's access to care, and I think that is an issue that we've been working on, that I worked on when I was in Harrisburg, which is making sure that there are sufficient healthcare resources around the Commonwealth. We actually developed a program when I was in Harrisburg. We called it the PIN Group, and it was the idea of trying to figure out where we had facilities that we needed to have in Pennsylvania to make sure that in other parts of Pennsylvania there was coverage. And when hospitals would come to us with issues, we would sort of look and say, well, how do you fit into the scheme of Pennsylvania? And that's something actually that I was part of discussions with Governor Josh Shapiro on his transition team. So I think access is important. And then I also think, having worked in the health insurance industry, I think it's making sure that there's affordable health care. And so I've spent a lot of my career working in the Medicaid space, which is a program that actually, when I was in Harrisburg, I was the lawyer who was involved with the creation of Health Choices, which was the first managed care Medicaid program. And that program obviously has expanded since then, and I've worked in that industry. And what I love about Medicaid healthcare is, your client there is a state government who really wants to make a difference in the lives of their Pennsylvanians, and your customers are Pennsylvanians who need help. And so I think making sure that that's a robust system so people have access to that care, so both facilities and also, frankly, the ability to pay for it or otherwise have coverage. Those are two areas that I'm focused on.
On your website, you voice concerns over large healthcare systems that have acquisitions and mergers. What can be done to prevent a loss of jobs or services when those types of acquisitions take place?
Well, I think when I look at that situation, I think the area there, sometimes it's unavoidable. I mean, the fact of the matter is that in the healthcare system, there is concentration. There is, like in any business, there is some value to having a consolidation. Now, that obviously affects people's jobs. And so we want to limit the loss of jobs, but we also want to make sure that these systems and these hospitals continue to operate, because a closed hospital, obviously can't help anybody and can't employ anyone. So the idea is you have to figure out how, when these for-profit entities come into Pennsylvania and want to take over these hospitals, for the Attorney General's perspective, is to make sure that a structure is put in place to protect jobs, protect access. And I think, with many of these things, a consent order is as part of the ability to make the acquisition happen. The Attorney General does have the ability to negotiate something like that with hospitals and with the entities buying the hospitals, and to make sure those are detailed enough to protect jobs and to protect access.
On your website, you note that you support efforts to make Pennsylvania protect reproductive freedom in a manner that is of the broadest acceptance. What does that mean exactly?
So I've been pro-choice my whole life. When I worked in the Ridge administration, the Casey case, which was the decision, was the law of the land at the time, was basically the law that says there's a right to choose with reasonable restrictions. And that was the position that Governor Ridge advanced, and that was the position that we, as part of his team, advanced. And I always felt that was appropriate. I think that in a situation as hard as we have is, with the Dobbs decision now, it's left to the states. And although I think there is some value to allowing states to make their own decision, the fact is, as a country, there should be an ability throughout our nation to have some reproductive freedom. And so I think some basic set of rules that go back to sort of the Casey decision is probably the best way to solve a problem where I know that there are people who feel very strongly on both sides. And I think the answer is, if we can find a way in the middle, it both accommodates those who feel that life is precious, which it is, but also those who feel that it's my body. So I think there's a way, and I think we had that with Casey, and we don't have it with Dobbs. And my hope is that we can have that again going forward.
You also talked about the importance of having an independent attorney general if the vote is challenged. If the vote is challenged, how do you address that?
Well, you have to call it balls and strikes. In other words, you have to make sure that it's a free and fair election. You have to make sure there was no fraud or no significant fraud. For those of us who've been in and around politics, there's always a few votes here and there, but no widespread fraud. And then whoever is the winner is certified as the winner, and we move forward. It's always been that way. The idea of protecting democracy was not something anyone ever thought about until, frankly, January 6th. And January 6th was a very troubling day in our American history. I mean, for the first time in American history, we did not have a peaceful transfer of power. And I, like many Americans, were just horrified. And we can't ever have that. We have to fight fairly. And when it's over, the loser has to shake the winner's hand and said, we'll do better next time. But you're the duly elected person. And as Attorney General, that's the rules I'm going to follow.
You had mentioned your support of open primaries. Why do you support open primaries?
Well, I'll give you an example. I'm someone who, in order to be a forward party candidate, had to resign from the Republican Party, which I did. But it also meant that for the first time in my adult life, I was not allowed to participate in an election. In fact, I went to my polling place that day to tell my judge of elections that I was actually running for Attorney General and couldn't vote. Otherwise, she'd be worried about me, because I'm one of those people that are considered super voters. They make it to almost every election possible, even the ones that most people don't bother with.
Now, you had mentioned when you worked as Deputy Secretary under former Governor Ridge, you were also responsible for environmental policy. How do you balance between supporting Pennsylvania's energy industry and protecting our natural resources? Yeah,
I was actually Deputy General Counsel, but thank you. It's an interesting issue. That's the balance, which is we obviously have an important energy industry in our Commonwealth, but we also have to figure out how to protect our environment. And as I was saying before, is the stakes are so much higher now, or they probably weren't any different then, but we didn't realize it now, how important it is to make sure we balance those two things. So I think fracking is an important part of how we are creating energy in Pennsylvania, and I think we have to continue to do that. But we have to do it in a way that's as safe and as impactless on the environment as possible.
What are your views on Pennsylvania gun laws, in particular red flag laws, universal background checks, and the existing laws that are there today?
Yeah. So look, the timing couldn't be more perfect. Today that you and I are talking is the day after the deadly shooting in Georgia. And I must say that every time this happens, we have a continuing cycle of thoughts and prayers, and nothing happens. And I have thought about this a lot, and obviously red flag laws are very important, background checks are very important, but the fact of the matter is the shooter in that case was 14 years old. So none of those policies would have caught someone like this. The only thing that would have stopped someone like this is the lack of the AR-style weapon. It seems like every single school shooting and most of the hundreds of shootings this year are with AR-style weapons. And so my view is, I think we need to try to find a way to get AR weapons off the street. I'm not suggesting we're taking people's guns away, but I'm suggesting that an assault weapons ban to stop having new AR weapons on the street is a tangible step to getting those weapons out of the hands of the people that are doing these terrible things.
Earlier this summer, the Commonwealth Court upheld a law, Act 40, that allows the Attorney General to appoint a special prosecutor to oversee and prosecute violent crime on SEPTA, Southeastern Pennsylvania's mass transit system. If you are elected, would you appoint this prosecutor?
I would. I feel that the DA of Philadelphia, Larry Krasner, has not done enough to prevent violent crime in Philadelphia. There was an ability for the legislature to create a carve-out, so to speak, for an inter-county agency. So it's not just Philadelphia, it's a multi-county agency. And I feel like we should have a prosecutor in place who will seek to prosecute those crimes. It is, as someone who has grown up in and around the Philadelphia area my whole life, safety is so important. And there is a sense of unease in Philadelphia. I mean, I think the new mayor is trying to do her best, but that was a good idea by the legislature. And as Attorney General, I will be enthusiastically find the right criminal prosecutor to take that job.
You've expressed an interest in protecting Pennsylvanians' retirement savings from unscrupulous schemes. What do you do as Attorney General to do that?
So again, the Attorney General oversees consumer protection. And I actually, in my career, spent 5 years as a financial advisor, helping seniors figure out their retirement. And so I bring to this office a unique experience, having been in the field as a financial representative. And so I think that I have seen in practices that are unfair to seniors, that are taking advantage of seniors. And I would like, as Attorney General, that would be an area that I would focus on. And we have the jurisdiction, again, under consumer protection, to put in place either investigations or other ways that we can try to reduce that.
What would be your top priority if you were elected?
My top priority for me is keeping Pennsylvania safe. I mean, at the end of the day, that is the most important thing. If you don't feel safe, you can't exist. And so I think, the things that the Attorney General can do, it's, obviously the Attorney General has concurrent jurisdiction over criminal law, but where there are areas of crime, organized crime, public corruption, the fentanyl crisis, and ways to sort of reduce that addiction, ways to make that's for me, that's top of mind. And, second would be, protecting democracy, which is making sure that going forward and even now, we have free and fair elections.
For those that might be unfamiliar, what are the burdens, particularly additional burdens, that third-party candidates face that perhaps major party candidates do not?
Well, it's interesting. Thank you for asking that question, and thank you for inviting me today. I mean, one of the issues is that there is an incentive by the two major parties to make sure that third-party candidates are really not seen or heard. And so today's interview, I appreciate, because PCN is taking the position that third parties should be heard. So I think it's, there's nobody, the other part about this particular race is the Attorney General's race has always been seen as kind of a pre-race for the governor's office. So both parties will line up with their respective candidates and elect someone who they then hope may go on to be governor. Governor Shapiro, who I'm friendly with and have served with him, that's a good example. But it makes it hard because the third parties don't fit into that duopoly, and so it's been hard. So we're hoping, we've gotten invitations and exposure, but I think that the two parties like it just the way it is, and that's why, for example, open primaries that would allow independents to vote, and you could have a rule that says independents need to pick a party to participate for that particular election. They'd rather not us have us involved. So we're going to kind of break through and hope that the people of Pennsylvania look us up and say, look, this is somebody who I think could be an excellent attorney general, regardless of party.
The Forward Party is a new political party. What is your goal in getting it recognized and established?
Right. So there's kind of a win-win. So obviously, I would love to be Pennsylvania's next attorney general. But if I'm not fortunate enough to be Pennsylvania's next attorney general, if we can get 2% of the vote statewide in 10 separate counties, then the Forward Party will be established as a permanent minority party in Pennsylvania, which is our first step towards being a third choice for Pennsylvanians for other offices. We're focused, the Forward Party is not running a presidential candidate, not running a Senate candidate. I'm the top of the ticket at Attorney General. We're focusing on local elections. And so if I'm successful in getting that 2% across the Commonwealth, then I will have helped establish the party for the next cycle so that other candidates can run as forwardists. At the moment, we have affiliated senators and representatives and other local officials who are forward affiliated. But since there's no party to join, there's no party to join. So if we're successful, there will then be a forward party in Pennsylvania that an incumbent could change their registration and be an incumbent forwardist. Or someone could run as a forward party candidate, as I am.
What is the main message of your campaign?
The main message of our campaign is we need an independent attorney general. That unfortunately, because of partisanship in our country and in our Commonwealth, a job that should be independent has become partisan. Each party has their respective Attorney General's Association that drive agendas. I think it's important that when Washington issues a set of regulations, that the Attorney General of Pennsylvania looks at them and says, what's right for Pennsylvania? Is this good for the people of Pennsylvania? Not, did it come from the Trump administration or did it come from the Biden administration? And that's such an important issue that I think people have sort of overlooked. And I think part of it is because, our political world has changed where there are certain offices that really should be nonpartisan.
How do you get your message out?
So, for example, a day like today, we are, focusing on digital advertising and focusing on persuadable voters in the center. And so we're doing that. We're, hoping to do some advertising. We'll obviously be doing kind of field work. We've got a lot of volunteers that are ready to go out there. And it's interesting because we think on Election Day, people have made up their mind about the presidential election and they've made up their mind about the Senate race, okay? But when you get to the Attorney General's race, I think a lot of voters would be open to the idea of an independent Attorney General and may say, you know what, that is a good idea. So that's how we're going to get our message out with people and hopefully with advertising and other ways. It's interesting these days because of social media, which sometimes makes me feel like the older candidate, you can get to people in a way you couldn't get to people before. It's not really all about TV and radio anymore, with all due respect to PCN.
What are the main issues that you hear when you talk to voters?
I think it's interesting. I think people are worried about the election. I mean, it's so interesting being a candidate this year with what's all going on. And even over the course of the summer, as we went from, the president running against Mr. Trump, and then the president dropping out, and then the vice president stepping in. It's more interesting to hear what they're saying. I think in Philadelphia, a lot of people ask questions about crime. I think, quality of life in Philadelphia, what's nice about Philadelphia is it's a very livable city. And, many cities, people isn't really like a residential corridor, but Philadelphia really has people living in it. And I think a lot of those people feel more uncomfortable than they used to. So that's something that's very important. And this healthcare issue that I've talked about a lot is something that affects people. I think, it's interesting when you talk about, for example, the Crozier-Keystone health system and the problems they've had, that really resonates with people because people know that that's a problem in outside of Philadelphia.
What interested you in working in public service?
I always enjoyed, I was never really involved in politics as a kid. I think when I started practicing law, I realized that what the difference government could make, and that to get involved in government, you have to get involved in politics. And so as a young lawyer, I was a center city young Republican, and really sort of saw the difference. But when I got to Harrisburg, I realized what a difference that you can make. I'm very proud in my career of the work I've done, and I didn't have a chance to mention it, but in a hiatus between my corporate life, I was the lead lobbyist for Autism Speaks, which was the puzzle piece people, and I was the lead lobbyist in the establishment of Act 62, which is a major piece of legislation that requires insurance companies to pay for services of kids with autism. And I must tell you, when Ed Rendell signed that bill in 2008, it changed the lives of 20,000 kids. But since then, it's changed the lives of countless others. It shows that government can make a difference. And when I look back on that, it also required bipartisanship. So if you remember back then, we had a Republican-controlled Senate and a Democratic-controlled House led by then Republican Denny O'Brien. And I actually worked closely with both Senator Don White and Denny O'Brien and then Deputy Speaker Josh Shapiro, who helped get this done. And interestingly enough, the other person who was instrumental in helping was Senator White's chief of staff, who has now grown up to be Joe Pittman, who is the majority leader of the Senate. So that says to me that bipartisanship can work and that government can make a difference. And I want to be part of that. And at this point in my career, I have this opportunity to get back into public service to make a difference at least one more time in the lives of my community.
How do you differentiate yourself from the other candidates in this race?
Well, I think the difference between I and at least the two major party candidates, Mr. Sunday is a prosecutor in York County, respectful of his career. Gene DePasquale was Auditor General, respectful of his career. I think, though they have both been in government, they have not also been in the private sector. I think I bring to the table, beyond the independence we've talked about, both a perspective of having been in government, having been around and part of working with the legislature, and in the private sector, so that I bring multiple fronts to the job that they just don't have. Not their fault. They both have they've served the public admirably, but I think I bring more to the table than they do. Because remember, the Attorney General's office is more than just being Pennsylvania's chief prosecutor. It's running an agency that has multiple responsibilities. And I, having worked in the governor's office and having worked closely with the Attorney General's office at that time, I know some of the issues that are less sexy, but are really also very important.
Eric Settle is the Forward Party candidate for Pennsylvania Attorney General. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.